Hello YouTube friends and welcome back to my channel. It's been a really long time since I did a last video, and I was thinking today, do you know what? I've tidied the room, I've put some makeup on, and I've finished off a quilt, so I've actually got something to talk about. And I wanted to talk about some of the things that I did wrong, some of the lessons that I've learnt. It's almost like a slight therapy for me. So it's always really good to talk about why I've done something, how I've done something, and what I've learnt from it. And I just like chatting. Also, I logged in the other day and I saw I'd got 75 subscribers, which for me was amazing. So thank you ever so much if you've subscribed. If you haven't and you want to listen to me talk nonsense about sewing, then feel free to hit the subscribe button. So today, and I do have a list, today I'm going to talk about the quilt that I made for my mum. So she's seen this, it was for her 70th birthday, so she's seen it already. And it is a Bargello quilt. So I'm going to talk a little bit about making this. I'm also going to talk to you about the quilting that I did on it, because this was the first big quilt that I've ever quilted myself. And I'm talking kind of large scale quilting. So I had to come up with a bit of a hack. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about that as well. So first things first, Bargello. So I was introduced to Bargello by watching one of the UK shopping channels called what was Sewing Quarter, and it's now Sewing Street. And Bargello is the process of using straight lines to make a curve, and traditional Bargello would use something like jelly rolls, and what you do is you have stripes going this way and you put them all together so that you have a big piece of fabric with lots and lots of stripes, and then you cut lots and lots of cross stripes again. So what you have is lots of squares of colour, and then just by realigning all of those squares of colour you get the Bargello effect, which is kind of, as we'd said, curves out of squares. However, I have a full-time job, 2 children, far too many hobbies, and I didn't have time nor inclination, because I really hate sewing over seams. So one of the quilts that I'm doing at the moment is like a log cabin type thing, and I always have to sew over a seam, and I've had to change the pressure on my foot to be able to go over the seams, and so the thought of having to sew over lots and lots and lots of seams really didn't fill me with much joy. So I did a lot of research. In lockdown I've spent far too much time online looking at fabrics, and I came across a shell rummel fabric called Tide and Time, and I think this pattern is Oceans, and it's fab. So that's probably not the best side. Let's look at this side. So what it is really long pieces of fabric with quite obvious straight lines that come across it. So there we go, that's a much better line. Let's see if we can hold it. I really like shell rummel fabrics. They're very natural, so kind of almost the opposite to the Tulip Pink stuff that I like, which is very bright and kind of in your face and kind of a contrived print. So it's a made up print of something, whereas the shell rummel stuff tends to be a reflection of nature. So it's like a bird or a leaf, or in this case, water. So this is all the fabric that I have left from this pattern, and I love it. And I loved all of the other stuff that came with it, but I just bought, I think, kind of 2.5 or 3 meters of this fabric, and I was really lucky because this is all I've got left. So if I'd have made any mistakes, I'd have been up the creek without a paddle. And I kind of emailed lots of places in the UK looking for more of this fabric, and I couldn't really find it. So I'm going to apologise about the light, because as mentioned, I have 2 children and a really busy life, which is great, and I appreciate that, but I've had to wait for them to go to bed, because the oldest one said, "Oh, Mummy, are you making a video? Can I be in it?" And any minute now I half expect her to walk through that door and then just this head appear over my shoulder. So back to the Bargello. Because I didn't want to have to start by sewing lots of coloured pieces of fabric together, I chose one solid piece of fabric that had very obvious lines. So then all I had to do was to sew that piece of fabric into a continuous loop, and then cut out lots of strips of fabric. Now you'll see that these have been sewn, that's why they've got this nice little line through it, and the idea is that you cut lots of different widths of your fabric. So mine went all the way down to 3/4 of an inch, being that you have a 1/4 inch seam on either side. So the smallest line in this quilt, which is probably this one here, is about 1/4 of an inch. And oh my god, it was fiddly. So that was fun. And then I think the largest one was like 2.5 inches. So the idea is that you cut out lots and lots and lots of strips of fabric, and then because there was an obvious line, when you then come to stagger, let's see if we can find, so this bit down here, when you then come to stagger it, you get that Bargello effect. When it goes over a large piece, you get quite an obvious Bargello, and we'll have a look at my quilt as we go. So I talked about the kind of traditional. I suppose this is more of a modern Bargello, or a cheat Bargello, and I'm always good for a cheat. I mean, the quilt looks fantastic. Mum loved it. She was really pleased with it. I was super freaking out about the thought of having to do a big quilt, because I said to her, maybe we'll make a small one. She was like, "Nah," and then I thought maybe I'll make pillow shams, and she was, "Nah." So we ended up making a big quilt. And I was super freaking out about how many kind of strips of fabric there was going to be and how I was going to do it. So, big fan of YouTube, but also big fan of Facebook, because when I started sewing my strips together, so I'd cut them all out, I'd got them on the tube, and I'd started cutting them out and I was sewing them together, and it was having this kind of banana effect. So, even though I was using my, 57D foot, so if I put that in, it's got this lovely little side guide. And so I was pretty sure that I was having a 1/4 inch seam, because my guide was showing me that I was having a 1/4 inch seam. What was happening is it was still kind of bending to one side. So when I was laying it out on the table and I was looking at it, it was going off to one side and it was driving me crazy. So I put out onto the Sewing Street Facebook group, and I was asking them about why is it doing this, and one of the lovely ladies said it's because you are sewing the seam up from the bottom every single time, and what I needed to do was to sew one up and then sew one down and then sew one up and then sew one down, which kind of bakes your noodle a little bit, because what you're having to do is constantly shifting your fabric up an inch. So what I had was an inch as the change between each strip. So first strip, second strip, next to it, an inch up, an inch up, an inch up. And then I followed a specific pattern. So I might go up 4, down 7, up 3, down 4, up, and so on and so forth. And that was giving me my curves, or my kind of sways as it was going across. But when you're then sewing from the top down, you need to make sure that you're doing it the right way and not pushing your fabric down. But hey ho. I ended up doing something like 24 strips, ended up with a banana. I had to unpick half of that, and don't tell my other half, because I went upstairs and used his electric pit trimmer to quickly, because could you imagine how many strips? 24 strips, and some of them are really little, and I ended up having to kind of undo a hell of a lot of my work. I could have cried, but hey, it was my mum's 70th birthday, so it needed to be right. So by the time I'd kind of figured that out, sorted out, I'd done 2 widths of my fabric, and I then had my Bargello. I then had to decide how I was going to show it, or how I was going to put it into the quilt, because I didn't have enough fabric. It was never going to work if you joined one long piece to another long piece. So what I decided to do was, I had these 2 vintage sheets. Now I can hear a lot of quilters go, oh, you should never use sheets. You shouldn't use sheets for backing and so on and so forth. And then the other half, I can always hear my friend Mary Ellen going, because she was devastated when I was cutting up a vintage sheet. And when she found out I was cutting up 2 vintage sheets, she nearly had kittens. Now, these vintage sheets I had bought probably 5 years ago from a White Elephant kind of vintagey kind of car booty type village sale in the village down the road, and they'd sat in a bag and they'd never been used. They also had like a yellow mark, which I tried to wash out but didn't kind of work on one of the sheets. So they, you know, they were great. They were a beautiful quality. They're kind of like this really harsh, yet not harsh, textured linen. And they are thick, but I think it's really worked well for the quilt. And as I'd said to Mary Ellen, they've sat for 5 years and never been looked at. If I put them into a quilt, they're going to be out, they're going to be used, they're going to be kind of touched and washed, and they're going to have a life, not just sat being a plain white sheet. So she kind of agreed with me in the end. And so they ended up making their way into this. So one sheet that didn't have the mark on it is the backing. The second sheet that did have the mark, it ended up being the kind of the edge piece, and I have actually folded it all up for Mum, but I'm going to unfold it because she gets it at the weekend. She's seen it before I bound it, that's why it's still here. And then it took me about 5 hours to sit, 5 hours, 2 films to sit and bind it. But let's have a look. I love this quilt. And I have made a quilt label for it, but I stitched out the pattern and thought, how am I going to put the words in? And then my friend Jane, who I've mentioned before, said to me, actually, you can need to put the words in, then put the and I don't know, she's going to come over and show me how to do it. So at some point I will put it on the back of my mum's quilt. But let's open this up. And here is my Bargello quilt. So here we go, straight lines achieving the curve. So I'll try and show you the full bit, but here we go. Look, see, I've gone down 4, I've probably gone up 4, and then down 7. And if I come in closer, let's see if this is going to work. Yeah, there you go. You can kind of get, you can kind of get a good feeling for all the steps. So there's an inch step in between, and then if I go up like this, you kind of get the gist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reposition the camera, because we all know that I can't edit, and there are many things that I'm good at. Editing is not one of them. So I probably should stop making videos, really. So what we did, or what I did, was I have a short piece at the top. I placed my Bargello in the middle. I have an edge all the way around, and then I have a deeper bottom. The concept being that Mum can then put this on her bed, she can pull that top bit down, she's got a bit that's going to hang over the edge, and the main part of her double bed will have this beautiful Bargello image on it. And the binding that I used was the leftover bit after I'd cut up all of this front piece. So the way that I've done that is, this is a short piece, so I've sewn a short piece to a short piece to the end of the Bargello, and then 2 long pieces down the side, and I had just enough to do straight binding, and I've mitered. I love my corners, I was so proud of my corners. And I've mitered my corners. So, and that was all, God, look at my nails. That was all done by hand while watching television. And I will point out that Tula Pink has done a binding video where she talks about using this foot, and she talks about using the notches. Let me get, there we go. She talks about using the notches. I think if I can just get that in. So notch 1, notch 2, notch 3. So these are 1/4 inches to help you get that really pristine mitered edge. And it worked a treat. And I basically sat there with my other half watching movies and just hand slip stitched all the way around this. And as I say, it took about 5 hours. But I think it came out beautifully. Now, the second piece that I want to talk about on this, and I'll zoom in, is you will see when the light shines on it, there you go, that quilting, what I wanted to do was just do the entire quilt in the same effect. I didn't want to take away from the pattern or the fabric, and so what I wanted was something that kind of held the quilt together, kind of stayed with the pattern, and I'm going to bring my chair back in again, stayed with the pattern, but then also kind of added to it. So it's very ocean, and so I thought, right, I'm going to do these kind of swirly squiggly lines, and then every single line on this quilt is basically the whole quilt, like a typewriter, like the old-fashioned typewriters, and they would have that ching that goes across the top where the paper and the ink strip would be. So I was thinking, right, I don't have a long arm. I'd love a long arm, but I don't have a long arm. What I have is a Bernina, and it's got this little flimsy tail on it. I'm going to show you that in the middle. And I thought, this is just not going to work. there's a lot of quilt, and because it's linen, it's heavy, which is a good thing. Now the quilt's made, it's heavy, it's got some texture, it's going to keep her warm. It's not going to smother her, but it's definitely going to kind of keep her warm. And by the time you put the batting in there and so on and so forth, I was starting to really procrastinate about doing this quilting, and I thought, this is not good, I need to kind of crack on with this. So I sat and I thought, well, I've got some options. Either I can buy a new table where the sewing machine sits lower, so that the edges are higher, so that when I roll the quilt will kind of glide through. And then I thought, right, so I need to go and buy a table. It's got to have some structure to it. My sewing machine is quite heavy, the quilt's quite heavy, I'm pulling it through. If that table goes over and smashes my sewing machine, I'm going to cry. I'm also going to then be out of pocket because these machines are not cheap. So then I'm thinking, yeah, that's not the best idea. So then I thought, okay, what else can I do? And this is where I'm going to introduce you to my second hack of the day. So this is my quilting hack. So let me just reposition the camera again so you can see Bluebell, my machine. Now, what I did was I turned Bluebell on her side and thought, okay, we're now going to have this nice big throat space, and I'm going to roll the quilt up and I'm going to be able to pull that through. I then had a quick trip to Dunelm. If you're in the UK, Dunelm, you'll know it well. If you're not, then Dunelm is a place where you can buy kind of curtains and fabric and bedding and garden bits and pieces and kitchen bits and pieces, and rugs and duvets and all sorts of kind of weird and wonderful things. And it is there that I bought a massive chunk of foam. Here we go. And as you can see, I've cut a Bernina size hole right through the centre. Now I'm going to turn this to the side. The depth of this just happens to coincide with the depth of my table. Now this was about £24, and then I've covered it with a very thick bin bag because I didn't want the fabric to have any tension, any resistance as I was running it through. So the idea is that this lovely piece of kit fits around the sewing machine, so that now when I'm stitching, the other half did quite happily part with a piece of plumbing tubing, and it's probably this thick, and it's really heavy. It was really thick but not heavy. So what I did was I wrapped the quilt around one piece, and that would sit on the outside, and then I used a pull noodle on the inside, or I might have done those the other way around, only because I didn't have two pieces of plumbing piece. And then basically I had to have my friend Michelle come, so I couldn't quilt in this room because there just wasn't enough space. But in my kitchen I have a peninsula, I suppose, so kind of like this kind of concept. So imagine that this is the wall that comes out, and then I have a peninsula that comes, so it's like attached to the wall, and it kind of sticks out like a breakfast bar really. And Michelle had to come over, and it was quite funny really, because there's me at one end holding the quilt, you can imagine, to me, and Michelle at the other end. And then Michelle, who isn't particularly crafty, she doesn't sew. I did teach her to sew, and she did make a Christmas advent calendar for her daughter, and she was really pleased, and her daughter loves it. It comes out every year, but she's never ventured back to the sewing machine again. So I had one end, she had the other end, and we were literally passing the quilt to and fro, and I was guiding it through. We'd get almost probably 2/3 of the way through, and then we had to quickly swap ends. Now, because of that, there was no foot operation. What there was the Bernina stitch regulator on the second option, which is basically if the fabric's moving, I'm stitching. If the fabric's not moving, I'm not stitching. And I had to be really careful when we swapped, because if you went that way or this way, you would have this lovely curved line and then a jug. But it doesn't really matter as long as I wasn't stopping in the same place. I mean, nothing's ever perfect, and this is the first one that I had done. If I'd been on a long arm, then yeah, that would have been fabulous, wouldn't it? Because I'd have just gone, and I might have done some meandering or thrown something in that was a bit more interesting. But to be fair, it probably took Michelle and I the best part of another 5 hours. So 5 hours to quilt it, 5 hours to bind it. It took me 3 hours to put the white fabric around the outside, and then to do the sandwich, which nearly killed me because I didn't have a big enough space, and I thought constantly something was going to fall on me or the dog was going to walk through with wet feet coming out of the garden. And however long it took me to make it. But I have to say, I really enjoyed the process. And now that I have this, I'm going to not be quite so scared of doing some free motion quilting. You know, I think I went to the Festival of Quilts and I was looking at some of the really clever Quilt as you go. And even when you look at the back, I'm not a big fan of the Quilt as you go when you have like the fluffy ends. So when they've put two edges together, I saw somebody that had done some really neat kind of butting up, and I thought, you know, I might have a go at that, so that you can do some really interesting stuff. I used to do a lot of free motion embroidery, so embroidering bees and animals and so on and so forth, and I think that's almost the far extreme of this, kind of doing the free motion quilting. So that's my mum's quilt. That was my process. Unfortunately, my list is now underneath the foam, and I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover, but as I can't find it, we'll just have to leave it there, I think. But anyway, it's been, as always, wonderful talking about the process, showing off what I've made. Mum loves it. That was the most important thing. I enjoyed the process. As always, if you have any questions, any comments, please leave them below. And apart from that, good evening, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.